There will come a moment, maybe in 30 years, maybe in 30 seconds, when you will be asked a question that no one can answer for you. Not your family, not your faith, not your philosophy. The question is this: who are you when everything you used to call you is gone? No body to identify with, no memories to anchor to, no story to tell yourself about who you've been. Just pure awareness, untethered, undefined, free in a way that feels like drowning. And in that moment, 99 out of 100 souls give the wrong answer. They say, I am what I was. I am the person who lived that life. I am a story I told myself. And with that answer, they chain themselves to a ghost. They become haunted by their own memory, trapped between worlds, unable to move forward because they're desperately clutching backward. This is what people call purgatory, limbo, the bardo, the in-between. But it's not a place. It's a choice. It's the choice to keep being a someone when you could finally just be. And I'm going to show you why we make this choice, why it feels so compelling, and how to prepare yourself now, while you're still alive, to give a different answer when that question comes. I know this sounds strange, maybe even frightening, but stay with me because what I'm about to share with you isn't speculation or wishful thinking. It's something I spent my entire life trying to understand, the fundamental nature of consciousness and what happens when the physical container for that consciousness dissolves. And what I discovered will change how you think about death. But more importantly, it will change how you live right now, today, because the fatal mistake souls make after death is really just the final version of a mistake most of us make every single day while we're alive. You see, you're terrified of death. And I don't mean in some vague, philosophical way. I mean in a visceral, 3 a.m, can't sleep, mind racing kind of way. And underneath that terror is a very specific fear that you probably haven't fully examined. The fear isn't really about pain or judgment or even nothingness. The fear is about disappearing, about becoming nothing, about the you that you've worked so hard to build and maintain and understand just evaporating like it never existed at all. But here's what I need you to understand, and this is where it gets uncomfortable, that you're so desperate to preserve that identity you're clutching so tightly, it's already temporary. It's already just a pattern, a story, a construction your brain creates moment to moment to give you a sense of continuity and control. You've never been a fixed thing. You've always been a process, a flowing river that keeps calling itself by the same name even though the water is completely different from moment to moment. Think about it this way. Who were you 10 years ago? Same name, sure. Same basic body, mostly. But are you really the same person? Same thoughts, same beliefs, same fears, same dreams? No, that person is gone. They dissolved gradually over time, and you barely noticed because the transition was smooth, because your brain kept weaving the story of continuity, kept insisting you're still you even though almost everything changed. You've already died 1,000 little deaths, and you didn't even realize it. You've already let go of countless versions of yourself and survived every single time. But we don't think about it that way. We tell ourselves we're continuous, stable, unchanging at our core. We build this elaborate story about who we are. I'm the kind of person who does this. I've always been this way. This is just who I am. And that story gives us comfort. It makes the chaos of existence feel manageable. It creates the illusion that we're solid ground, when really we're just waves in an ocean, constantly forming and reforming and dissolving. And this is where the fatal mistake begins, not after death, but right now. We spend our entire lives practicing the wrong relationship with our own consciousness. We practice identification. We practice grasping. We practice believing that we are the story instead of the awareness in which stories arise. And when death comes, when the body that's been anchoring that story suddenly stops, we don't know how to be anything else. So we grasp. We reach backward. We try desperately to reconstruct the familiar sense of self, even though there's no physical foundation for it anymore. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looks like, what happens in that moment right after the body stops. Imagine you've fallen asleep deeply, so deeply that there are no dreams, no thoughts, no sense of being anyone at all. Just pure void. And then suddenly you become aware again. But this time, body sensation. No weight. No temperature, no heartbeat, no breath, just awareness itself, floating in a space that has no coordinates. And the first response, the absolutely overwhelming first response, is terror. Because you've spent your entire life defining yourself by your body, by your physical sensations, by the boundary between inside and outside. And now that boundary is gone. And in that terror, that moment of absolute disorientation, consciousness does what it's been trained to do. It reaches for the familiar. It tries to reconstruct. It starts replaying memories, grasping for the story, attempting to rebuild the sense of I that gave everything meaning. I was this person. I lived this life. I had these relationships. I did these things. I believed these ideas. And with each grasp, with each attempt to reconstruct the familiar self, consciousness starts to create a kind of echo, a phantom version of the identity that just dissolved. This isn't metaphorical. This is what every mystical tradition, every near-death account, every description of the afterlife is actually pointing at. The soul that can't let go becomes a ghost. Not because some external force is trapping it, but because it's trapping itself. It's haunting its own memory. It's refusing to move forward into the vast openness of what consciousness actually is, because that openness feels like annihilation. And here's the tragic irony. The thing we're most afraid of, the disappearing, the becoming nothing, that's not what happens when you let go. That's what happens when you grasp. When you try to remain a separate self without a body to anchor that self to, you become increasingly contracted, increasingly isolated, increasingly caught in the repetitive loop of your own story. You become less, not more. You become a fragment of consciousness identifying with a memory instead of recognizing yourself as the infinite awareness that gives rise to all memories. But if you let go, if you stop trying to reconstruct the familiar you, something else happens. Something that every enlightened teacher, every mystic, every person who's touched the depth of meditation tries to describe. You recognize that you were never just the wave. You were always the ocean. You were never just a story. You were always the awareness in which stories arise and dissolve. You were never the temporary form. You were always the consciousness that gives rise to form. Now I know what you're thinking. This sounds abstract. This sounds like philosophical nonsense that doesn't connect to actual experience. So let me make this concrete. Let me show you how you can feel this right now while you're still alive. Close your eyes for a moment. Take a breath and notice that you're noticing. Notice that there's something watching your thoughts, something aware of your emotions, something that sees your story but isn't trapped inside it. That's not your brain. That's not your thoughts. That's consciousness itself. That's what you actually are underneath all the costumes you've been wearing. And here's what's revolutionary about recognizing this while you're still alive. When you start to identify not with the contents of consciousness, not with the thoughts and feelings and stories, but with consciousness itself, death stops being a crisis. Because you realize that what you actually are doesn't die when the body dies. The form changes. The story ends. The character exits the stage. But the awareness that was watching the whole play, that doesn't go anywhere. It was never located in the body to begin with. Think of it like a movie projector. The images on the screen change constantly. Characters come and go. Stories begin and end. But the light of the projector, the awareness that makes the whole movie possible, that never changes. That's continuous. That's what you actually are. You're not the character on the screen. You're the light that makes the character visible. And when the movie ends, the light doesn't die. It just stops projecting that particular story. But here's the problem. Most people spend their entire lives so absorbed in the movie, so identified with the character, that they forget they're the light. They forget they're the projector. And when death comes, when the movie ends, they panic. They try to keep the story going. They try to remain the character even though the film has run out. And that's the grasping. That's the fatal mistake. That's what creates the experience of being stuck between worlds, haunting the edges of a life that's already over because you refuse to let it be over, refuse to recognize that you were never just the character to begin with. Every spiritual tradition points at this truth in different languages. The Buddhists call it recognizing your Buddha nature. The Hindus call it realizing your Atman, not the ego. The Christians call it dying to self and being reborn in spirit. But they're all pointing at the same recognition. You're not the temporary form. You're the eternal consciousness that briefly wore the form like a costume. And death is just the moment when the costume comes off. Now here's why this matters urgently, practically, right now. You don't have to wait until death to practice this recognition. In fact, you can't wait until death because by then the patterns are too deeply ingrained. If you spend your whole life practicing identification with form, with story, with the separate self, then when the form dissolves, panic is inevitable. But if you practice now, while you're alive, recognizing yourself as awareness instead of as the contents of awareness, then death becomes something completely different. It becomes a transition you're prepared for. It becomes a doorway instead of a crisis. And how do you practice this? It's simpler than you think, though not easy. Every time you meditate, every time you sit in silence and notice you're not your thoughts, you're just the space in which thoughts appear, that's practice. Every time you observe your emotions instead of being completely consumed by them, every time you recognize there's something watching the fear, watching the anger, watching the joy, that's practice. Every time you let go of needing to be right, needing to defend your story, needing to prove who you are, that's practice. You're loosening your grip on the separate self. You're getting comfortable with the spaciousness underneath identity. You're preparing for the ultimate letting go. And here's what's beautiful and also challenging about this. The preparation isn't about becoming a better person in some moral sense. It's not about racking up good deeds so you get into heaven. It's about fundamentally shifting your relationship with your own consciousness. It's about recognizing again and again that you are the ocean, not just the wave. That you are awareness itself, not just the temporary pattern of thoughts and feelings you've been calling yourself. Think about sleep for a moment. Every night you practice death. Every night you let go of your waking identity. You dissolve into unconsciousness, and then mysteriously you return. But notice what happens. When you wake up, you immediately grab onto the story again. You reconstruct yourself. You remember who you're supposed to be, and you slide back into that role so seamlessly you don't even notice you were gone. But what if you started paying attention to that transition? What if you started noticing the gap between sleep and waking? That moment where you exist without yet being anyone in particular. That's the space. That's the awareness underneath identity. And the more familiar you become with that space while alive, the less terrifying it will be when you meet it permanently after death. The fatal mistake isn't really a mistake in the sense of a wrong turn or a bad decision. It's more like a reflex, a deeply conditioned habit of consciousness. And habits can be changed, but only with practice, only with awareness, only with consistent attention to the pattern and a willingness to do something different. Right now, in this life, you have the opportunity to practice a different response. You have the chance to become familiar with the spaciousness of your own awareness. You have time to loosen your grip on the story of who you think you are. Because here's the truth that will either liberate you or terrify you, depending on how you hear it. You're going to die. Not maybe, not probably, but certainly. The body will stop. The brain will cease functioning. The story you've been telling yourself about who you are will come to an end. And in that moment, you will face the question that no one can answer for you. Who are you when you're not the body? Who are you when the story is over? Who are you when there's nothing left to grasp? And 99 out of 100 souls in that moment give the wrong answer. They say, I am what I was, and they spend what could be eternal freedom trapped in the echo of a life that's already finished. But you don't have to be the 99. You can be the one who recognizes the question for what it is. Not a test to pass, but an invitation to let go. An invitation to stop being a someone and finally just be. An invitation to recognize that the wave was always ocean, that the character was always just light on a screen, that the separate self was always just a temporary dance consciousness was doing. So here's what I want you to remember. Here's what I want you to practice. Here's the answer to the question you'll face when everything else falls away. I'm not the wave. I'm the ocean temporarily waving. I'm not my thoughts. I am the awareness watching thoughts arise and dissolve. I'm not my body. I am consciousness experiencing embodiment. I am not my story. I am the vast space in which all stories unfold. And when this form dissolves, as it inevitably will, I will not grasp for what I was. I will recognize what I've always been. I'm already free. I'm already whole. I'm already home. The wave doesn't need to become the ocean. It already is the ocean. It just needs to stop pretending it's only the wave. This isn't about preparing for death in some distant future. This is about waking up to what you are right now. Because the fatal mistake, the grasping, the clinging to form, it's not something that starts after death. It's something you're doing right now. Every time you identify completely with your thoughts, every time you defend your story like your life depends on it, every time you forget that you're the awareness watching the whole drama unfold. Death just makes it unavoidable. Death forces the question. But life is offering you the same question every single moment if you're willing to look. Who are you when you're not your thoughts? Who are you in the gap between breaths? Who are you in the silence underneath all the noise? That's what you'll need to know when the body stops. That's the recognition that makes death a doorway instead of a dead end. And you can discover it now. You can practice it now. You can become so familiar with your own awareness, with the consciousness that underlies all experience, that when the experiences stop, when the body drops away, there's no panic. There's just recognition. Oh, this is what I always was. This vast, open, aware presence. I was never trapped in form. I was just experiencing form for a while. If this perspective shifted something for you, if it gave you a different way to think about death or consciousness or what you actually are underneath all the stories, I genuinely want to hear about it in the comments. What opened up? What scared you? What felt true? Because this isn't easy material. This challenges everything we've been taught about who we are. And sometimes just sharing that we heard it, that it resonated, that it made us think differently, that helps all of us feel less alone in this strange journey of being conscious. And if you want more of these uncomfortable, deep, weird philosophical explorations, subscribe. Because I'm going to keep diving into the questions that don't have easy answers, the truths that challenge everything we think we know, the invitations to see ourselves from angles most people refuse to look from. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being curious enough to sit with this. Thank you for being willing to question your own nature, to face your fear of death, to consider that maybe you're not what you think you are. And maybe that's not a loss. Maybe that's the most liberating truth you could ever discover. The wave was always ocean. You were always free. You just forgot. And death is just a moment when you either remember or you don't. Remember now, while you still have time to practice.